The summer heat pressed down on the small town of Millbrook like a heavy blanket. Officer Derek Mason sat in his patrol car, parked outside the local convenience store, watching people come and go. He had been on the force for 8 years now, and somewhere along the way, the badge on his chest had become more than just a symbol of service. It had become a crown. Derek was known around town for his attitude. He walked with his chest puffed out, spoke with a tone that demanded respect rather than earned it, and had a habit of reminding people who was in charge. The other officers at the station had tried talking to him about it, but Derek would just laugh it off. He believed he was untouchable, protected by the law he was supposed to serve. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Derek received a call about a disturbance at the town square. Someone was reportedly causing trouble near the fountain. Derek rolled his eyes and started his engine. These calls were usually nothing, just locals getting worked up over minor issues. But it gave him a chance to show everyone his authority. When he arrived at the square, he saw a man standing near the fountain, talking on his phone. The man was in his early 40s, dressed in casual clothes, jeans, and a simple shirt. Nothing about him seemed threatening or unusual. A few people were sitting on nearby benches enjoying the afternoon, and some children were playing by the water. Derek parked his car and stepped out, adjusting his belt where his gun and radio hung. He walked toward the man with heavy steps, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The man glanced up briefly, still talking on his phone, then continued his conversation. This immediately annoyed Derek. People were supposed to pay attention when he approached. Marcus Webb had been having a normal day. He was in Millbrook visiting his elderly mother, who lived in a retirement home just outside of town. After spending the morning with her, he decided to take a walk through the town square, a place he remembered fondly from his childhood. While walking, his colleague called him about an urgent work matter, and Marcus stopped by the fountain to take the call. He noticed the police officer approaching but assumed the officer was just patrolling the area. Marcus gave a polite nod and turned slightly to continue his phone conversation. He was discussing an important case, speaking in measured tones, completely unaware that his simple gesture of acknowledgement had just insulted Officer Derek Mason. Derek stopped a few feet away from Marcus and crossed his arms. His face had already taken on that expression, the one that said he was in charge and expected immediate compliance. When Marcus didn't end his call right away, Derek felt his anger rising. In his mind, this was disrespect. This was someone challenging his authority in public. After about 30 seconds, Marcus wrapped up his call and turned to face Derek with a friendly smile. He had no idea what was coming. Derek didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a deliberate show of dominance. The officer's first words were sharp and accusatory. He demanded to know what Marcus was doing in the square and why he thought he could ignore a police officer. Marcus was taken aback. He explained calmly that he was just making a phone call and hadn't realized the officer needed to speak with him urgently. He apologized for any confusion, but Derek wasn't interested in apologies or explanations. He saw an opportunity to demonstrate his power, especially with several townspeople watching from the benches. He began questioning Marcus more aggressively, asking for identification, wanting to know where he was from and what his business was in Millbrook. Marcus remained calm and polite. He reached for his wallet to provide his identification, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any misunderstanding. He handed Derek his driver's license and explained again that he was just visiting his mother. His voice was steady, respectful, showing no sign of the frustration he was beginning to feel inside. Derek took the license and barely glanced at it. He was more focused on maintaining his intimidating presence than actually checking Marcus's information. He made a show of looking Marcus up and down, as if searching for something wrong, something he could use to justify his aggressive approach. The people on the benches had stopped their conversations now. They were watching the interaction unfold. Some of them recognized Derek and his reputation. They had seen him act this way before with others in town. A few exchanged worried glances, wondering if this situation was going to escalate. Marcus could feel the tension building. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. Still, he maintained his composure. He knew that getting defensive or argumentative with a police officer, especially one who seemed to be looking for conflict, would only make things worse. He answered every question politely and kept his hands visible at all times. Derek's questions became more personal and invasive. He wanted to know what Marcus did for a living, how much money he made, whether he had ever been arrested. Each question was designed not to gather information but to humiliate and assert dominance. Marcus answered truthfully, mentioning that he worked in the legal field but not elaborating further. This answer seemed to irritate Derek even more. He made a sarcastic comment about lawyers and how they thought they were better than everyone else. Marcus didn't take the bait. He simply said that he respected law enforcement and had no desire for any conflict. He asked politely if there was a specific problem or if he was free to go. That question, reasonable as it was, pushed Derek over an invisible line. In his mind, Marcus was challenging him, questioning his authority to detain him. The officer's face reddened and his voice grew louder. He told Marcus that he would decide when the conversation was over, not the other way around. The atmosphere in the square had shifted completely now, from peaceful to tense. The confrontation at the town square was drawing more attention now. People walking by stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones, not to record yet, but ready to if things got worse. Everyone could sense that Officer Derek Mason was looking for trouble where there was none. Marcus stood still, his hands now at his sides, palms visible. He had been in difficult situations before in his career, but nothing quite like this. He was being harassed by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. Yet he knew that any wrong move, any hint of resistance could be twisted into something dangerous. Derek circled around Marcus slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. He was performing now, putting on a show for the growing audience. He made comments loud enough for others to hear about how suspicious Marcus looked, how people like him probably came to small towns to cause problems. None of it made any sense, but Derek wasn't concerned with logic. He was concerned with power. One of the women sitting on a bench, an older lady named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in Millbrook her entire life, stood up. She had watched Derek bully people before and stayed silent. But something about this situation bothered her more than usual. This man being questioned had done absolutely nothing wrong, and everyone could see it. Mrs. Patterson called out to Derek, her voice shaky but determined. She told him that the man had just been making a phone call and hadn't caused any disturbance. She suggested that maybe this was all a misunderstanding and everyone could go about their day peacefully. It was a brave thing to do, speaking up to someone like Derek Mason. Derek spun around to face her, his expression furious. He pointed at her and told her in no uncertain terms to mind her own business or she would be next. His hand moved closer to his belt as he spoke, a subtle but clear threat. Mrs. Patterson sat back down quickly, her hands trembling. She looked at Marcus with apologetic eyes, but Marcus gave her a small, understanding nod. He appreciated her effort. The officer turned back to Marcus, even more agitated now. He had been challenged by a civilian, and in his mind that meant he needed to reassert his dominance even more forcefully. He stepped right up to Marcus, their faces just inches apart, and demanded to know if Marcus had a problem with how police officers did their job. Marcus took a slow breath. He could smell the coffee on Derek's breath and see the anger in his eyes. This was a man looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. Marcus chose his words carefully. He said that he had great respect for law enforcement and appreciated the difficult job they did every day. He added that he was sure this was all just a routine check and that he was happy to cooperate in any way necessary. His calm response should have de-escalated the situation, but it had the opposite effect on Derek. The officer saw Marcus's composure as arrogance, as someone thinking they were smarter than him. Derek grabbed Marcus by the arm, his grip tight and painful. He announced loudly that Marcus was being detained for suspicious behavior and failure to comply with police orders. Marcus didn't resist the grip, but he did speak up. He asked what specific law he had broken, or what suspicious behavior the officer was referring to. His voice remained calm and professional, but there was a firmness to it now. He was no longer just going along passively. He was asserting his rights, something Derek was not used to people doing. This was the moment Derek had been building toward. In his mind, Marcus had just openly defied him in front of witnesses. The officer's other hand moved to his service weapon. He didn't draw it yet, but his hand rested on the grip in a threatening manner. He told Marcus that if he continued to resist, there would be serious consequences. Several people in the growing crowd gasped. A man started recording on his phone now, holding it up clearly so Derek could see. Another person called out that the man had done nothing wrong, and that someone should call the police chief. Derek ignored them all. He was in his own world now, a world where his authority was absolute and any challenge to it was a personal attack. Marcus felt the situation spiraling out of control. He could see Derek's hand on his weapon and understood that this officer was unstable enough to actually use it. Marcus knew he needed to try one more time to bring reason into this encounter. He spoke slowly and clearly, stating that he was not resisting, that he was cooperating fully, and that he simply wanted to understand what law he had violated. Derek's response was to grab his radio with his free hand. He called for backup, reporting that he had a hostile suspect at the town square who was resisting arrest and potentially dangerous. Everything he said was a lie, and everyone watching knew it. Marcus was standing still, speaking calmly, and had not made a single aggressive move, but Derek was creating his own narrative. While waiting for backup, Derek continued to grip Marcus's arm. He pushed him toward the patrol car, roughly forcing him to move. Marcus complied without fighting back, but he continued to state clearly and repeatedly that he was not resisting and that this use of force was unnecessary. He was making sure his words were heard by everyone present, creating a verbal record of what was happening. The backup arrived within minutes. Another patrol car pulled up and Officer Sarah Chen stepped out. Sarah was relatively new to the force, but she was already respected for her professionalism and level-headed approach to police work. She immediately assessed the scene and her expression showed confusion. She saw Derek gripping a well-dressed, calm man, while a crowd of concerned citizens watched. Nothing about the situation looked like it required the aggressive response Derek had called in. Sarah approached and asked Derek what was going on. He launched into his version of events, claiming Marcus had been causing a disturbance, had refused to identify himself, and had resisted detention. Sarah looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, then back at Derek. Something didn't add up. Marcus seized the opportunity. He addressed Officer Chen directly and calmly explained what had actually happened. He told her that he had been making a phone call when Officer Mason approached him. He said he had provided his identification immediately when asked, and had cooperated fully with every request. He added that multiple witnesses had seen the entire encounter and could verify his account. Sarah looked at the crowd. Several people nodded vigorously. One man held up his phone and said he had video of the last few minutes if the officers wanted to see it. Mrs. Patterson stood up again, braver now with another officer present, and confirmed that the man had done nothing wrong and that Officer Mason had been aggressive from the very beginning. Derek's face was red now, but not just from anger. He was beginning to realize that things were not going as he had planned. He started to argue with Sarah, telling her that these civilians didn't understand police procedure and that she needed to back him up. He still had his hand on his weapon, and his grip on Marcus's arm hadn't loosened. Sarah took a step closer to Derek and spoke in a low voice that only he and Marcus could hear. She told Derek to release the man and to take his hand off his weapon. There was something in her tone that was both respectful and firm. She wasn't asking as a junior officer. She was telling him as a fellow professional who could see that he was making a serious mistake. Derek Mason refused to back down. His pride was on the line now, and in front of all these people he couldn't afford to look weak. He ignored Officer Sarah Chen's quiet warning and tightened his grip on Marcus's arm instead. His other hand remained firmly on his weapon, fingers wrapped around the grip in a way that made everyone watching increasingly nervous. Sarah tried again, this time speaking more urgently. She reminded Derek that there were witnesses and video recording, and that whatever happened next would be documented and reviewed. She was trying to save him from making a career-ending mistake, but Derek was too far gone in his anger and pride to hear her. Marcus remained completely still during this exchange between the two officers. He could feel Derek's fingers digging into his arm hard enough to leave bruises. He understood that he was in serious danger. This officer was unstable and armed, and the situation could turn deadly in an instant. Yet Marcus also knew that any sudden movement on his part could be the excuse Derek was waiting for. The crowd had grown to about 20 people now. Some were locals who recognized Derek and his reputation. Others were visitors to Millbrook who had stumbled upon this tense scene. Several more phones were out and recording. An elderly man in the crowd called out that someone should call the mayor or the police chief immediately. A younger woman was already on her phone speaking quickly and quietly to someone. Derek suddenly made his decision. He released Marcus's arm and in one swift motion drew his service weapon. The movement was so quick that Sarah barely had time to react. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. Several people backed away quickly while others froze in shock. Derek pointed the gun directly at Marcus's chest, his hand steady despite his obvious agitation. The town square fell into a terrible silence. Even the children who had been playing by the fountain stopped and stared. Time seemed to slow down as everyone processed what was happening. A police officer was pointing his weapon at an unarmed man who had done nothing wrong, in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses. Sarah immediately stepped forward, her voice loud and commanding now. She ordered Derek to lower his weapon. She told him that there was no threat, no justification for deadly force, and that he needed to holster his gun immediately. Her hand moved to her own weapon, not to draw it, but in a gesture that showed she was prepared to intervene if necessary. Marcus remained frozen in place, his hands slowly rising to shoulder level, palms facing Derek. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had faced difficult moments in courtrooms and intense negotiations in his career, but nothing had prepared him for staring down the barrel of a gun held by someone who seemed desperate to justify using it. Derek's voice was shaking as he spoke. He ordered Marcus to get on the ground. He claimed that Marcus had made a threatening move and that he felt his life was in danger. Everyone watching knew this was a complete fabrication. Marcus had been standing still the entire time. But Derek was trying to create a narrative, building a justification for his actions even as they were happening. Marcus didn't argue or question the order. He slowly began to kneel, moving with extreme care to avoid any motion that could be misinterpreted. As he lowered himself to the ground, he kept his eyes on Derek and his hands clearly visible. He could see the officer's finger near the trigger and understood that he was moments away from being shot. Sarah moved closer to Derek, positioning herself at an angle where she could see both the officer and Marcus. She was speaking continuously now, her voice firm but not aggressive. She kept telling Derek that everything was under control, that the situation was secure, and that he needed to lower his weapon. She was trying to talk him down, to break through whatever panic or rage had taken hold of him. Just then, another vehicle pulled into the square. This wasn't a patrol car. It was a civilian car, but it moved with purpose and authority. The door opened and a man in his late 50s stepped out. He was wearing casual clothes, not a uniform, but something about his presence immediately commanded attention. This was Captain Robert Hughes, the police chief of Millbrook, who had been called by one of the concerned citizens in the crowd. Captain Hughes took in the scene instantly. He saw Derek with his weapon drawn on a man lying on the ground, Officer Chen trying to de-escalate, and a crowd of frightened citizens recording everything. His expression darkened immediately. He had received complaints about Derek's behavior before, had given him warnings and chances to improve. Now those warnings had led to this. The captain walked forward quickly, his voice booming across the square. He called Derek by name and ordered him to holster his weapon immediately. There was no room for discussion or debate in his tone. This was a direct order from a superior officer, given in a voice that expected instant obedience. Derek's head turned toward the captain, his expression a mixture of defiance and sudden fear. He tried to explain himself, starting to repeat his fabricated story about Marcus being a threat. But Captain Hughes cut him off mid-sentence. The captain repeated his order louder this time, telling Derek that he had 3 seconds to holster his weapon or face immediate suspension and arrest. The weight of those words finally broke through Derek's anger-fueled state. His hand trembled slightly as he slowly lowered the gun. He looked around at the crowd, at the phones recording, at Officer Chen watching him with disappointment, and at Captain Hughes staring at him with barely controlled fury. Derek holstered his weapon. Captain Hughes immediately walked to Marcus, who was still on the ground. The captain extended his hand and helped Marcus to his feet, apologizing profusely for what had just occurred. His voice was sincere and filled with genuine regret. He told Marcus that this behavior was absolutely unacceptable and did not represent the Millbrook Police Department or its values. Marcus stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. His hands were shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. He accepted the captain's apology with a nod but said nothing. His mind was racing, processing what had just happened and how close he had come to being shot. The captain turned to Derek and told him to hand over his badge and service weapon immediately. Derek's face went pale. He started to protest, claiming he had been doing his job and protecting the community. But the captain held up his hand, silencing him. Derek was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He was to leave the scene now and report to the station later for formal questioning. Derek fumbled with his badge, his fingers clumsy with shock and anger. He unclipped it from his uniform and handed it to the captain. Then he removed his weapon belt and holster, handing that over as well. Without his badge and gun, Derek suddenly looked smaller, less imposing. The swagger and arrogance that had defined him were gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Officer Chen was asked to escort Derek back to the station in his patrol car. Sarah nodded and guided the now former officer away from the square. Derek walked to the patrol car like a man in a daze, getting into the passenger seat without argument. As the car drove away, some people in the crowd actually applauded, relieved that the situation had ended without anyone being hurt. Captain Hughes turned his full attention to Marcus. He asked if Marcus needed medical attention or if he would like to sit down somewhere quiet. Marcus declined medical help but admitted he could use a few minutes to collect himself. The captain guided him to a bench away from the crowd. Captain Robert Hughes sat down on the bench next to Marcus, giving him space but staying close enough to talk privately. The crowd in the square was beginning to disperse now that the confrontation was over, though several people lingered to make sure Marcus was okay. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had tried to speak up earlier, approached with a bottle of water from a nearby vendor and offered it to Marcus with a kind smile. Marcus accepted the water gratefully and took a long drink. His throat was dry from the adrenaline and stress of the past 30 minutes. He thanked Mrs. Patterson, who patted his shoulder gently before walking away. The simple gesture of kindness from a stranger helped ground Marcus and reminded him that not everyone in authority abused their power the way Derek Mason had the captain. Waited until Marcus seemed calmer before speaking. He introduced himself properly and explained that he wanted to get Marcus's full account of what had happened. He also wanted to make sure Marcus understood his rights and options moving forward. This was no longer just an unfortunate encounter. It was a serious incident that would require a formal investigation, reports, and potentially legal action. Marcus took a deep breath and began to recount the events from the beginning. He explained that he was visiting his mother at the retirement home and had stopped in the square to take a work call. He described how Officer Mason approached him aggressively from the start, how the situation escalated despite his complete cooperation, and how the officer had drawn his weapon without any provocation whatsoever. As Marcus spoke, Captain Hughes listened carefully, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. His expression grew more troubled with each detail. This wasn't just bad policing. This was assault, false imprisonment, and possibly attempted murder depending on how a prosecutor might view it. The captain knew that Derek's actions could cost the department dearly in reputation and potentially in a lawsuit. When Marcus finished his account, the captain closed his notebook and looked at him directly. Hughes explained that several witnesses had already given statements, and multiple videos of the incident existed. The evidence clearly showed that Derek had acted without justification and had violated both department policy and the law. Derek Mason would face serious consequences, both professionally and potentially criminally. Marcus listened quietly, processing this information. Part of him felt vindicated that the truth was so clear and documented. Another part of him felt exhausted and angry that he had been put through this experience simply for making a phone call in a public square. He thought about all the people who might have faced similar treatment from Derek, but without witnesses or video to prove what had happened. The captain then asked Marcus a difficult question. He wanted to know if Marcus intended to file a formal complaint against Derek and possibly pursue legal action against the officer or the department. Hughes was honest about the situation. He explained that Marcus would be well within his rights to do so, and that the department would cooperate fully with any investigation or legal proceeding. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about his response. The captain respected the silence, not rushing him to answer. Marcus finally spoke, his voice thoughtful and measured. He said that he definitely wanted to file a formal complaint. What Derek had done was dangerous and wrong, and there needed to be accountability. However, Marcus also wanted to understand what the department itself was going to do about this officer. Captain Hughes appreciated the directness of the question. He explained that Derek was currently on administrative leave without pay pending the investigation. Once the investigation was complete, there would be a disciplinary hearing. Given the severity of Derek's actions and the clear evidence against him, the captain expected that Derek would be terminated from the police force. Additionally, the department would be referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. This answer satisfied Marcus somewhat. He could see that Captain Hughes was taking the situation seriously and wasn't trying to cover up or minimize what had happened. The captain seemed genuinely appalled by Derek's behavior and committed to addressing it properly. Marcus asked how long the investigation would typically take. The captain estimated it would take 2 to 3 weeks to complete the internal investigation, gather all witness statements, and review the video evidence. He gave Marcus his personal contact information and promised to keep him updated on the process. He also provided Marcus with information about filing a formal complaint and about victim support services available through the county. As they talked, Marcus began to open up more about his background. He revealed that he wasn't just someone who worked in the legal field, as he had vaguely mentioned to Derek earlier. Marcus Webb was actually a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office, specializing in civil rights cases. He had spent years prosecuting police misconduct, corruption, and abuse of power cases across multiple states. Captain Hughes's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. Of all the people Derek Mason could have chosen to harass and pull a gun on, he had picked a federal prosecutor who literally specialized in cases like this. The irony was almost unbelievable. The captain let out a long breath and shook his head, muttering something about the universe having a sense of justice. Marcus gave a tired smile. He explained that he hadn't mentioned his position earlier because he wanted to be treated like any other citizen. He believed that everyone, regardless of their job or status, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect by police officers. The fact that he was a prosecutor shouldn't matter. What mattered was that Derek's behavior toward anyone would have been wrong. The captain agreed completely. He had been a police officer for over 30 years and had dedicated his career to serving the community with integrity. Officers like Derek, who abused their authority and treated people with contempt, made the job harder for every good officer trying to build trust with the community. Hughes had been trying to address Derek's behavior issues for months, but Derek had always managed to stay just within the boundaries of what was tolerable, until today. Marcus asked about Derek's history with the department. Had there been other complaints? Other incidents? The captain was careful with his answer, explaining that he couldn't discuss personnel matters in detail, but he acknowledged that Derek had received multiple complaints about his attitude and treatment of citizens over the years. Unfortunately, most of those complaints had been difficult to substantiate without clear evidence or witnesses willing to testify. This information troubled Marcus but didn't surprise him. He had seen this pattern many times in his career. Problem officers often had long histories of complaints and concerning behavior before they finally did something serious enough to force accountability. The system often protected them until the evidence became undeniable. Today, thanks to multiple witnesses and video recordings, the evidence was undeniable. The captain stood up from the bench and offered to drive Marcus wherever he needed to go. Marcus declined politely, saying he had his own car parked nearby and would be fine. However, he did accept the captain's offer to walk with him to his vehicle, just to make sure there were no other issues. As they walked, several people from the crowd approached Marcus to express their support and offer to serve as witnesses if needed. One young man, who had recorded much of the confrontation on his phone, gave Marcus his contact information and said he had already uploaded the video to a secure cloud storage in case it was needed for the investigation. Marcus thanked him and took his information. Another woman, a local teacher, apologized for what Marcus had experienced in their town and said that most people in Millbrook were good, decent folks who were embarrassed by Derek's behavior. These interactions reminded Marcus why he did the work he did. Most people wanted justice and fairness. They wanted police officers who protected, rather than threatened. The problem was that a few bad officers could poison the relationship between law enforcement and the community, making everyone less safe. Holding those officers accountable wasn't about being anti-police. It was about protecting the integrity of policing itself. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon in the town square. Marcus Webb had returned to his normal life and work, prosecuting cases and managing his heavy caseload at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But the incident in Millbrook stayed with him. He checked his phone regularly, waiting for updates from Captain Hughes about the investigation into Derek Mason. True to his word, the captain had kept Marcus informed throughout the process. The investigation had been thorough and swift. Over 20 witnesses had given statements, all of them consistent in describing Derek's aggressive behavior and unjustified use of force. The video recordings from multiple angles left no room for interpretation or doubt. Derek had acted completely outside the bounds of acceptable police conduct. The internal affairs investigation concluded that Derek Mason had violated multiple department policies, including excessive use of force, unlawful detention, drawing a weapon without justification, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The report was damning and detailed, running over 40 pages with witness statements, video analysis, and expert opinions on proper police procedures. The disciplinary hearing took place on a Tuesday morning at the Millbrook Police Department headquarters. Marcus had been invited to attend if he wished, but he was dealing with a trial that week and couldn't make it. Captain Hughes called him that afternoon to share the results. Derek Mason had been terminated from the police force effective immediately. His certification as a law enforcement officer in the state was being revoked, meaning he would never be able to work as a police officer again. But the consequences for Derek didn't stop there. The district attorney's office had reviewed the case and decided to file criminal charges. Derek was being charged with assault, false imprisonment, and official misconduct. If convicted, he could face up to 5 years in prison. The charges sent a clear message that police officers who abused their authority would face the same justice system they were supposed to serve. Marcus felt a sense of relief when he heard this news, not because he took pleasure in Derek's downfall, but because the system had worked the way it was supposed to. Too often, problem officers faced minimal consequences or were simply moved to another department. This time, there would be real accountability. The story of what happened in Millbrook had spread beyond the small town. Local news outlets picked up the story and then regional media followed. The video of Derek drawing his weapon on an unarmed man in a public square went viral on social media, sparking conversations about police accountability and the importance of citizens documenting encounters with law enforcement. Several civil rights organizations reached out to Marcus, asking if he would be willing to speak about his experience. Initially, he declined, preferring to let the legal process play out quietly. But as he saw the public reaction and the conversations his case was generating, Marcus changed his mind. He agreed to give one interview to a major news network. During the interview, Marcus spoke thoughtfully about his experience. He made it clear that he had great respect for law enforcement and knew many officers who did their jobs with integrity and honor. He emphasized that this wasn't about condemning all police. It was about holding accountable those few officers who betrayed the trust placed in them. He also talked about the importance of witnesses and video documentation in cases like his, noting that without them, his word against Derek's might not have been enough. The interview resonated with people across the country. Marcus received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories of encounters with aggressive or abusive police officers. Many of them had not reported these incidents because they feared nothing would be done or that they wouldn't be believed. Marcus's case gave them hope that accountability was possible. Back in Millbrook, the community was dealing with the aftermath in its own way. Many residents felt embarrassed that their town had made national news for such a negative reason. Others felt relieved that Derek was finally being held accountable after years of complaints and concerns. The town council held a special meeting to discuss police, reform, and community relations. Captain Hughes attended that meeting and listened to hours of testimony from residents about their experiences with local law enforcement. Some praised officers who had helped them. Others shared concerning stories about Derek and his behavior over the years. The captain took notes and promised to implement new training programs focusing on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community policing. The department also announced a new policy requiring all officers to wear body cameras at all times while on duty. These cameras would automatically activate whenever an officer drew a weapon or activated their emergency lights. The footage would be stored securely and available for review in case of complaints or incidents. It was a significant step toward transparency and accountability. Derek Mason's criminal trial took place 6 months after the incident. Marcus attended this time, sitting quietly in the courtroom as the prosecution presented its case. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury watched the videos from multiple angles, heard testimony from witnesses, and listened to expert analysis from police training instructors who explained how Derek's actions violated every principle of proper law enforcement. Derek's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had felt threatened and was following his training. But this argument fell apart under scrutiny. Multiple experts testified that nothing in the situation justified drawing a weapon, and that Derek's behavior from the very beginning of the encounter violated standard police procedures. The prosecution also presented evidence of Derek's history of complaints and aggressive behavior, painting a picture of an officer who regularly abused his authority. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Derek Mason guilty on all charges. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke directly to Derek about the serious breach of trust he had committed. Police officers are given significant power and authority in society, the judge explained, and when they abuse that power, they undermine public safety and the rule of law itself. Derek Mason was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay a fine and complete anger management and ethics training. Though given his revoked certification, he would never return to law enforcement. As Derek was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face showed a mixture of shock and resignation. The arrogant swagger he had displayed that day in the town square was completely gone. Marcus watched this final chapter of the case with mixed feelings. He took no joy in seeing Derek sent to prison, but he felt that justice had been served. More importantly, he hoped that Derek's case would serve as a deterrent to other officers who might be tempted to abuse their authority. The consequences had been swift, public, and severe. After the trial, Marcus filed a civil lawsuit against Derek Mason personally for assault and emotional distress. He won a judgment for damages. Though Derek had limited assets to pay it, Marcus donated the entire settlement to a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to people who had experienced police misconduct but couldn't afford attorneys. Captain Hughes reached out to Marcus several months after the trial. He wanted to invite Marcus to speak at the police academy graduation ceremony. The captain thought it would be valuable for new officers to hear Marcus's perspective and understand the real-world consequences when law enforcement goes wrong. Marcus agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to contribute something positive from his negative experience. At the graduation ceremony, Marcus stood before a room full of young officers about to begin their careers. He told them his story, not to discourage them or paint all police as bad, but to emphasize the enormous responsibility they were about to take on. He reminded them that the badge and gun they would carry weren't symbols of power over others. They were tools to serve and protect the community. Marcus spoke about dignity and respect, about treating every person they encountered as a human being, deserving of fairness regardless of their background or circumstances. He talked about the courage it takes to de-escalate situations rather than let ego and anger drive decisions. He shared how most officers he had worked with throughout his career were good people trying to do a difficult job, and how those officers were betrayed and endangered by the bad ones who abused their authority. The graduates listened intently. Many of them looked uncomfortable during parts of Marcus's speech, confronting the reality that wearing a badge didn't automatically make someone right or just. But this discomfort was exactly what Marcus hoped to create. He wanted them to think carefully about the kind of officers they would become. After the ceremony, several graduates approached Marcus to thank him for his words and to apologize on behalf of law enforcement for what he had experienced. Marcus appreciated their sincerity and encouraged them to be the kind of officers who made him proud to work alongside law enforcement in pursuing justice. The incident in Millbrook had changed several lives permanently. Derek Mason was in prison, his career and reputation destroyed by his own arrogance and poor choices. Captain Hughes had implemented significant reforms in his department and become a regional advocate for police accountability. Officer Sarah Chen, who had tried to intervene that day, was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of training new officers in de-escalation techniques. For Marcus, the experience had deepened his commitment to civil rights work. He continued prosecuting police misconduct cases with even greater dedication, always remembering that afternoon in the town square when he stood on the other side of the system. He understood viscerally now what many of his clients and witnesses felt when confronted with abusive authority. The small town of Millbrook had learned important lessons as well. The community became more engaged with their police department, attending town halls and providing feedback on policies. Trust began to rebuild slowly as residents saw real changes in how officers approached their work. The department saw a decrease in complaints and an increase in community cooperation with investigations. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had spoken up that day despite being threatened, became a local hero. She was invited to join the Police Oversight Committee and brought a citizen's perspective to discussions about policy and training. She often said that seeing Marcus remain calm and dignified in the face of Derek's aggression had given her courage to speak up, even when frightened. The incident became a case study in police training programs across the country. Videos of the confrontation were used in academies to show officers exactly what not to do, and how quickly a situation could spiral out of control when an officer let ego override judgment. Derek's case served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing the badge. Years later, Marcus still occasionally thought about that Tuesday afternoon in the square. He thought about how differently things could have ended if Derek had pulled the trigger. He thought about all the people who had faced similar situations without witnesses or cameras to document the truth. And he renewed his commitment to fighting for justice and accountability, knowing that his work made a real difference in people's lives. The costly lesson Derek Mason learned that day extended far beyond his own life. It rippled out through a community, a police department, and eventually into the broader conversation about policing and society. His arrogance and abuse of power had been exposed, and the consequences served as a reminder that no one, not even those in positions of authority, was above the law. Justice, when it finally came, was thorough and uncompromising.